So, for all of the movies that I was shockingly allowed to watch, music was a whole different beast. And growing up, I was allowed to and encouraged to listen to like classic rock, jazz, and the blues. And when I talk about classic rock, I mean classic rock, like 1970s and before. Now, with the exception of those genres, really the only other kinds of music that I was allowed to listen to was praise and worship or Christian rock. Yeah, I remember walking through the CD sections of stores and just imagining what music sounded like when it wasn't praise and worship. I tried to be sneaky and I'd look at all the different covers that I could before being caught. And not that I was going to get in trouble for looking at these albums. I don't think my parents put too much thought into me looking because they figured, and I figured, I was never going to be listening to any of it. Or at least we all figured I would never listen to any of it. But I am pretty sure that my parents were just waiting for that shoe to drop. There was a time when I was pretty young. I can't remember exactly how old I was. But I was introduced to a band and a style of music that I had never actually heard before. Now, I've called myself the black sheep of the family up to this point, but I've held back on a little detail. I wasn't the only one in the family that was a little different. One of my older cousins, who I got to see every now and again, because he primarily lived with his mom and not with my aunt and uncle, but he would ultimately be the one who helped me or helped guide me into forming my own way. And I ended up unknowingly followed in his footsteps with the whole rejecting the notion of God and faith at a very young age. I admired my cousin. I mean, I still do, and I will always be so grateful to him for a few of the things that he introduced me to. One of which actually came at that youthful age. I ended up staying the night at my aunt and uncle's one night. It was on a weekend that he was visiting. And he and I stayed out in the backyard. And we stayed up pretty late, actually, as he told me all about stuff like MTV. And that's back when MTV actually was music-oriented. And shows like Beavis and Butthead. He told me about horror movies. And a little band called Green Day. And I spent that whole night just living vicariously through every word he said as he described all of it. I went home that next day knowing that I had to figure out some way to manage to watch Beavis and Butthead. And more importantly, I had to figure out how I was going to listen to Green Day. Now, shockingly, I don't remember there being too much of a fuss when I asked my mom and dad if I could get the Dookie album. You know, I don't know why they bought it for me, honestly. I'm glad they did, but I don't know why. Maybe it was because of the cartoony cover, or maybe they just knew that it was about time to let me kind of venture out a little bit. See, find my own interests. Whatever the reason, the first time that I listened to that album, I was so confused. The music sounded so much different than all of the stuff that I had been listening to. The structure of the songs was catchy, but it was like really imperfect. The vocals were super carefree, and they just sounded honest. It honestly, and it weirded me out. To the point where I actually didn't listen to that album as much as I thought I would. I was used to certain things in music, and the only similarity between Dookie and everything else was that there were instruments and there was singing. But what that album ended up doing for me was it stirred a pretty deep curiosity. And it would be years before I would listen to any other album that wasn't Christian. And when I finally did, it was kind of a blurred line. I mean, it was Creed, and it was their Human Clay album. Now, before you roll your eyes, let me just tell you, that album rocks. It's a great album. Get over it. But I put that thing on constant repeat. I couldn't listen to it enough, and it drove my family absolutely nuts. But as much as I loved that album, I still didn't feel a real and deep connection to it. I think it clicked more with me than Dookie did, just because it had just a little bit of aggression to it. And that seemed to help subside some of those feelings and those thoughts that I was having. So towards the end of the year 2000, I was 13. I was full of nothing but hate and negativity. I felt completely worthless. And the more that I tried keeping my mental state a secret out of shame for how my friends and my family might react to it, the more that I felt utterly alone. Depression, it's a nasty motherfucker. And when you are at your most vulnerable state, it can really lay out the abuse. Your age, your gender, your sexual orientation, your faith mean absolutely nothing to it. When depression is on the prowl inside of your mind, it is the most malicious predator. So one day, I went to the mall with my mom, and while she was visiting some of the boring stores, I decided to go to the music and movie store. I was going to do what I always did, wander around looking at all the album covers and wishing that I could listen to it. Back then, when you went to one of these stores, they would have listening kiosks. And they were always different at most stores, but this one in particular, it had 3 sides to it. And each side had like 3 or 4 albums that you could select and listen to. You would put the headphones on. They were always attached to the kiosk. And once you pushed the button on the album, it would start. I had never used one, or at least one that wasn't at the Bible Superstore. Yes, that was a real place. But that day, I decided I was going to do it. My mom was off shopping, and I had the time. I could be sneaky, and I could listen to something new, something different. I walked up to the kiosk, and I put the headphones on, and I looked at all the different selections. And I could not tell you what any of the other selections were. My focus homed in on one. It grabbed all of my attention. The color scheme was awesome. It was green and it was black and it just looked weathered. And the 4 guys on the cover, they looked like total badasses. I had no clue what the music was going to sound like, but I felt driven to hear it. So I turned up the volume and I selected that album. And the intro, it was kind of quiet and kind of unnerving. And then there was this deep breath, and the music really began its little tease. And I could feel something shift inside of me. Within 30 seconds of this song, it built up to this roaring vocal, and the music just erupted. It was heavy, it was punishing, and I was frozen in place, just holding onto the headphones. That first verse kicked in, and as the song was sung, I felt this overwhelming sense of relief. It was freeing. It was uplifting. I mean, the chorus barreled through, and I was just in absolute awe. I had spent so much time feeling so alone, feeling like I was the only one going through all of this confusing and frightening emotional and mental turmoil. I felt like I had no voice, and even if I had a voice, I didn't have the words. But there I was, standing at this listening kiosk in an FYE, listening to music that not only had the voice, but it was saying all of the words that I wished I could. I wasn't alone. The band was Godsmack, and that album was Awake. The song that I listened to, it's the first song on that album, and it's called Sick of Life. I mean, I was hooked. I knew with everything inside of me, every part of my being, I knew that I had to have that album. And I knew that I needed more music like it. It was an instant connection. Of course, trying to convince my parents into letting me have an album by a band called Godsmack was probably going to be a pretty difficult task. Not to mention, it also had a pretty large parental advisory tag on it. I figured I was in for a dogfight over it, and I immediately went to work inside of my head to try and figure out the best arguments for me to make so that I could get that album. So my mom walked up to me, and I quickly took those headphones off. And she asked what I was listening to, and all I could respond with was a shrug and a nothing, just looking. I don't think she bought it. As I said, looking back, I'm pretty sure that my parents knew that I was in need of finding my own music and my own interests. And I'm pretty sure, in fact, I'm pretty positive, I know, they knew it was going to be drastically different than what they enjoyed and what they had introduced me to. So we left the mall, and I continued to put together my case. I would drop little hints here and there, to test the name of the band out. I needed to gauge their response to it. They obviously weren't thrilled about the name, but then I found an article about the band. And they described in the article where the name came from, and I remember smiling because the name, as it turned out, had nothing to do with drugs or with blasphemy. They had named the band after the idea of instant karma. You berate someone for something, and then it happens to you. I continued to insert these little hints here and there that I really wanted to listen to Godsmack. Which again, over the years, I'm pretty sure my parents were just waiting for me to finally ask and stop beating around the bush. And eventually, I did. I remember we ended up having this whole conversation about it. My parents were hesitant, but they understood. It was the most passionate I had been about something for quite a while, and I believe that they got it. They didn't want me to have the parental advisory version, though. That was their compromise. I could have the album, but it had to be the edited version. The compromise didn't matter to me. I just had to have that album. And I'll never forget listening to it all the way through for that first time. It was so much more than what I had expected it. And every song, minus one of the instrumentals, hit such deep emotions inside of me. It turned out that one of my friends, who was actually allowed to listen to pretty much whatever he wanted to and watch pretty much whatever he wanted to, he was also a fan of Godsmack's. So I ended up telling him all about how my parents were finally letting me get the album, but it was going to be the edited version. He looked bummed, and that I was stuck with this edited version. But then he offered to get me a copy of the real thing, and also a copy of their first album. Man. To this day, I don't think I have ever played two albums nearly as much as I did those two. Godsmack's music opened up the fucking floodgates for me. Sure, they're not the heaviest, and they weren't even the angriest, but their words and their music were and still are the most meaningful to me. I felt this physical shift inside of me, like something was free. I mean, something was honest. And I told everybody I could about Godsmack. And the more that I ended up talking about them, the more that my friend and my cousin started giving me more bands to check out. It was such an exciting time, finally being introduced to Metallica, Pantera, Mudvayne, Tool, Rob Zombie, Slipknot, etc. I mean, this list goes on, and it was overwhelming, but in the best way. Life didn't get easier because of the music that I was listening to, though. In fact, some would say that with what follows, music didn't save my life at all. But it did. And even though I have believed for so many years that it did the majority of the saving back then, I was wrong. Music, especially Godsmack, have done the majority of their saving in my adult years. You see, I believe that I connected with Godsmack's music on such a deep level because subconsciously, or dare I say, spiritually, I knew that I was going to need it when I really tripped up in life. I can't help but believe that music has been teaching me to find my own voice. It's been guiding me, allowing me to scream when I needed to cry when I break down, and to laugh and sing when I get a win. And it all started with Godsmack. So with the highs come the lows. And I was close to hitting an all-new low. I felt great, and I felt the surge of comfort with all of this new music that I was constantly listening to. I felt revitalized, like I had beaten the darkness and things were going to be better from that day on. But that's part of the problem, isn't it? We tend to have a good day, a week, a month, however long. And then we immediately assume that everything is going to be good. Permanently good. We let our guards down, and then we suddenly take the good days for granted. And when we do that, the drop that can happen can sometimes be just unbearable to deal with. I came very close to not being able to deal with my bad days. 3 times, in fact, in the span of about 2 years. The first time that I decided to kill myself, I put a blade to my wrist. I remember staring at the steel against my skin and wondering what it would be like, afterwards. I thought about if anyone would give a damn that I was gone. I figured my family would be sad for a little while, but at least they would still have their perfect son. They'd be able to move on and just chalking me up to the normal response that Christians tend to have when there's a tragedy, which is we just have to hope they knew Jesus. So I added pressure to the blade, and I felt it starting to pierce my skin. I saw the blood starting to form on the edge of the blade, and a funny thing happened. I was suddenly terrified. So I pulled the knife away from my wrist and I sprinted to grab a towel to stop the bleeding. I washed the cut. Luckily, I hadn't put the knife all that deep, so I was able to get it cleaned and under control after just a little bit. I was home alone that day, and as I was trying to get the bleeding under control, holding pressure against the cut with the towel, I began to panic about how I was going to keep this a secret from everyone. I didn't want to have to explain it. I figured I could put a large Band-Aid on it, but then everyone would notice it and ask about it. So I thought maybe I could wear long sleeve shirts until it was fully healed and the scabs went away. But I didn't have many long sleeves, and the sudden change in wardrobe might be a little too obvious. So I resorted to just focusing on getting the bleeding to stop, and then I would just act as though nothing were wrong. If anyone noticed the cut and asked, I would just act like I didn't know where it came from. And that worked. I kept my arm facing down, constantly being conscious of when the inside of my left arm was exposed around people. No one ever noticed it, and I never had to explain it. Which a part of me was relieved, but there was this other part that wanted people to notice. It wanted people to ask. It was that part of me that was awakened with all of the new music that I was listening to. It wanted people to notice and ask because it wanted me to get help. And instead of listening to that part of me, I just let the comfort of the negativity and my hate and my resentment control my thoughts, and I found myself getting angrier with the people around me. The second attempt came a little later. I had found a small rope in our garage one day and decided that because seeing the blood when I tried to cut my wrist had scared me out of following through, I would avoid blood altogether. Plus, hanging myself seemed to have the advantage of not allowing any second thoughts. As soon as I made the drop and the rope tightened, that would be it. So I tied the rope to the light that was in my room, and I pushed my bed as far to the side as I could. It had been directly underneath my light. And so I made a noose, and I stood on the very edge of my bed. And I put the noose around my head. I remember making a mental apology and then stepping off of my bed. I hit the floor immediately. I had felt the rope barely tighten around my throat and then just not being there anymore. I learned something about myself that day. I was terrible at making nooses and tying knots. I was pissed. I already felt like such a failure, worthless and useless, and not being able to end my waste of existence was just the rotted cherry on top. So I threw a fit when I looked at the untied rope. I wanted to destroy everything. And I had never felt so low as I did in that moment. Some people might not be able to relate to that kind of mentality. They might find it absurd or stupid for me to say that failing at killing myself twice made me feel even more useless than I already did. But that's the kind of perspective that depression can alter in people. It's a bit different for everyone, but the principle is there. I managed to go a little while without another attempt on my own life, but it ended up happening again. It was just one of those days where everything felt wrong. I felt like I couldn't breathe, concentrate, and school was it just wasn't going well that day. Looking back on it, I can't pinpoint one specific thing that triggered it. I just felt like I was going to cry, which made me feel embarrassed. And when you are feeling embarrassed, you tend to believe that all eyes are on you. I walked home focusing on just holding it together long enough for me to get inside. I made it in and then broke down almost immediately. And once again, I felt embarrassed and I felt weak. I felt hopeless and nothing was helping. To this day, I am eternally grateful that my mom and dad never owned a gun. If they had, I know for a fact I would not be here today. Judging from those first two attempts, you would think that had I had a gun, I would have been too scared to pull that trigger. But the truth is, I would have pulled it, knowing that everything would have been over before I ever had a chance to second guess my decision. The gun and my fingers would have done the decision making for me. Knowing that the sight of blood had scared me out of digging that blade into my flesh, and knowing that I couldn't tie a knot strong enough to hold my body above the floor, I resorted to the most ridiculous attempt. I filled my bathtub with water, and I placed my arms underneath my body, and I submerged myself into the water. I had seen plenty of drowning death scenes in movies, and I figured it would be quick. And if I pinned myself under the water, I wouldn't be able to get out of it. So I held my breath for as long as I could, and I could feel my body tensing and struggling. And when I tried to fight it, I was taught a lesson in fight or flight. I wasn't submerged for very long before my arms became free and shoved my body out of the water. My mind wanted to die, but the rest of me had other plans and had taken action. Soaking wet, I gave up on trying to kill myself. I had 3 chances, and I simply couldn't fucking do it. It was over. I had to deal with it. After that 3rd attempt, life kind of seemed to lighten up a little bit for me. I channeled more of what was in my head through the music that I was listening to, and I turned the volume up louder, and I let the music speak for me. And it helped more than I will ever be able to properly convey. I had Godsmack on a loop, and the more I channeled my emotions through their music, the better I felt. I give that band so much credit. Those that know me the best know that I always say that music changed my life, but Godsmack saved it. I stopped thinking about suicide altogether, and I was still incredibly angry, and I had a ton of shit to work through. But not thinking about suicide was a huge win. Suicide is no joke. I've attempted it 3 times and have been checked in on a handful more times during the course of my life. Depression, especially unchecked, is one of the most dangerous and detrimental experiences people can have. The damage that it causes, especially in circumstances involving suicide, it has this ripple effect that just never stops causing pain. I failed at suicide, and yet the ripple effects from those attempts are still happening. I gave myself over to those thoughts long ago, and I have struggled to get myself out of their grasp ever since. This is the moment where I encourage you to take an extra second with those around you. Offer a hug or a pat on the back. There's nothing wrong with letting people know that they matter. Now, I can't speak for everyone who struggles with depression and or, suicidal thoughts, but I can say, and I will say, that if someone comes to you, if they show the courage to speak about what's going on, don't offer advice. Don't try to say the perfect thing that's going to turn their lives around. And don't offer your thoughts and prayers. The truth is, when we decide that we have to open up about our issues, all we're looking for is someone to just hear us. Just let us get the words out. Let us get the emotions out. A quiet and a gentle recognition, and just a simple, that sucks. It goes a long way. If you know someone who has already opened up to you, say hi. Give them a reason to believe that they matter. Ultimately, that's what we all need, right? Reassurance that our lives are not pointless. So the first time that I tried alcohol, I had to have been like 10 or 11 years old. I snuck a few sips from the whiskey and the beer that my dad had. On the random occasions that he had a bottle of whiskey, it was always kept in the freezer to remain chilled. And I remember having this notion that if you drink whiskey, not doing shots, but actually drink it like they do in the movies, it made you cool. Like boss level cool. Whiskey is a brute of a drink. And if you take your time with it, if you drink it slowly, it was almost like an act of power. I would pretend to drink whiskey with the sun tea that my mom would make. But I remember seeing a bottle in the freezer and deciding to steal a couple swigs from it. made my throat burn, and I felt like I was going to die. But I also felt like a complete badass. I personally didn't know many kids my age who were willing to try whiskey. It wasn't long after that I was at a friend's house, and his parents had stepped out for a little while. We both decided, we took the opportunity to see what kind of booze they had. There really wasn't much, or at least nothing that we would be able to get away with taking. But my friend, he found a bottle of Kahlua, and because it was there, and we had set out to have a sip of something grown up, we each took turns taking a couple of shots. To this day, I hate Corona. It's disgusting. I mean, it was worse back then, but I still hate it. It took less than a couple of years for me to move on from stealing sips to just drinking. And the first beer that I actually ended up drinking was a Corona. I was hanging out with a couple friends, and my parents were gone for the night, and we managed to get a 6-pack. So, with my parents gone, we sat in the garage, and we drank it. And I loved every drop. At the end of the pack, we buried the empty bottles in the large trash can that was in the garage, trying to keep the glass from touching. Which meant that we could only actually get a couple of bottles in the trash. And I had to end up spending the next, week secretly throwing away a bottle 1 or 2 at a time. I loved that 6-pack, though. Most of the time you hear about young ones trying the rebellious first beers and suffering for it. They tend to keep doing it out of the sheer act of rebellion, regardless of how gross the alcohol makes them feel. I didn't have that. I drank that first beer quickly. I didn't chug it. I just drank it fast because I really enjoyed the taste. I savored the last couple that I had, and I loved the buzz that it gave me. I loved that carefree feeling. There was something different about my approach to being a cliche kid. When I agreed to try and get some beer that night, and all those previous times of stealing sips and shots, they were never a blatant act of rebellion. I was rebellious by nature, but when I started trying alcohol, I did it because it was available. And it was just something to do. Was I worried about being caught by my parents? Of course. But at the same time, I also figured that I was already such a disappointment to them. I wasn't. I was just stupid and in my own way. So why not lean into it? If they caught me drinking, I would have been in the worst trouble in my life. But I was already miserable, so what did it actually matter? It was this mentality that led me to continue drinking and eventually start smoking a ton of weed. My days of substance abuse were just ways to numb my senses and shut my mind off for a bit. I would actually say that my days of smoking cigarettes were more about rebellion than my days of smoking weed. We never had any of the talks when I was growing up. My parents didn't talk to me about drugs and alcohol, with the exception of telling me that to try alcohol meant I had to wait till I was legal. And the most we talked about drugs was that they were bad for you and that they could make you dumb. I also had the DARE program in school, which was basically there to tell you that if you ever tried any drug, you would be shamed by society and drop dead. Substance abuse wasn't really discussed properly in school or at home. I mean, I had more discussions about not smoking cigarettes and the dangers behind them than I did anything else. Both of my parents had been smokers. My mom had quit long before my dad, but it took a while for my dad to be able to leave all the nicotine behind. They definitely didn't want me following that trend, and I'm sure it made them a little nervous when I would go outside and pretend to be smoking. I would grab a cigarette butt that my dad had flicked away, and I would inhale on it pretty deep, just trying to get any kind of smoke from it. He always put them out, though, before flicking them away, so I never got anything from them. I didn't try weed until after I was 13. I was with the same friends that I had been when we drank our Coronas, only now the oldest one was driving and my other friend was in the passenger seat. He was packing a bowl into a pipe. I was in the back seat just smelling that unique aroma of marijuana and just feeling excited to try it. My friend in the passenger seat, he finished packing the bowl, he lit it, and he took a hit. As he blew the smoke out, he began to cough like he was dying. But he was smiling. Watching that smoke cloud come out of my friend was awesome. It was so potent and it was so thick. Suddenly, I felt a little nervous. I wasn't nervous to try weed, or even to cough my lungs out. No. I wasn't even nervous about what the consequences could potentially be. No. I was nervous about not doing it correctly. Because when you smoke out of a pipe, there's a trick to it, and I didn't want to mess it up. So my friend passed me the pipe, and he taught me how to smoke. I took a practice hit at first, just to get the process down, and then I went in for the real deal. I took this massive hit, inhaling as much as my lungs would allow me to inhale, and I blew that smoke out, coughing harder than I had ever done before. It fucking hurt. And then, it didn't. I was young and I was inexperienced, so the high came quite quick and really strong. I felt amazing. I had never been so relaxed in my life as I was in that moment. I couldn't give a shit about my depression, my anger, all of my negativity just seemed to vanish. It was glorious. By the time high school started, I was on a mission to smoke as much weed as I could. I loved it. And luckily, I had a handful of friends who also loved to smoke. And being high was relieving, and it made me feel good. I got invited to our school's smoking corner, which was just outside of the school. Like, just outside the school grounds, I mean. And it was in this neighborhood that was right next to the school. All of us smokers, we gathered there for our lunches, and we would just smoke as many cigarettes as we could in the short amount of time that we had. I was the kind of kid that never had just one specific kind of group that I was a part of. I knew and I had grown up with kids in every clique. But my fellow smokers, they were the ones that I felt the most comfortable around. They listened to the same music as I did, and they made it a point to introduce me to new bands. And they seemed to be just as hateful, or at least as angry, at the world as I was. There was a kinship there. And a few of us, we got high together. My main group of friends, though, they did not smoke. And they definitely did not approve of my smoking and hanging out with the stoners. Looking back, I will give myself credit for being able to balance the two separate groups really well. I wasn't stoned every day, and I didn't smoke cigarettes every day. There were lots of days that that I was sober, hateful, and playing a character to placate myself and those around me because I just didn't want to be outcasted. At this point, I had been able to really dial down the character that I had created for my parents, and in its place, I had created an evolved version. To this day, I really wished that I would have just spoken up. It always bums me out that I felt like I had to put on this persona for everyone. I feel like I lost a lot of quality time with people. If my friends from back then hear this or see this, they might be a little confused because I was around a lot and I engaged with the group a lot. They might have different memories of me laughing all the time, being as goofy and silly as possible. But the sad truth is, I did a lot of that just to keep up the appearance. Not all of it was an act, though. There were plenty of times where the laughs and the enjoyment were real. And to those moments, I owe an eternal debt because they helped keep me going. And to everyone around me at that time, I owe an apology for convincing myself through fear that I couldn't fully trust the ones that were closest to me to hear what I really needed to say. So during my freshman year, one of my best friends introduced me to the band Alice in Chains, and their music broke me. It was heavy and it was heartbreaking. Every word sung by Lane Staley just tore through me because once again, I felt like the songs were speaking for me. His openness about depression, anger, and addiction was just incredible. Now, I had just stuck to smoking weed and drinking, and on one occasion I did smoke opium. But I had drawn the line at doing any of the harder stuff. But I knew that I could easily find myself in the throes of drug abuse if I didn't watch myself. And listening to the songs about Lane's struggles with addiction made it all the clearer to me that I should never touch anything harder than what I was already doing. And then Lane Staley died. And his words, they carried a heavier weight with them. They felt more real, and it scared the shit out of me. It crushed me. And the night that I heard about his death, I cried. I had never cried over a celebrity's death before. But I did that night because my mind became this onslaught of just focusing on my depression and thinking about the failed suicide attempts and thinking about the stupid personas that I was convinced I had to create and live in. And to me, Lane's death was basically a preview of what my future was going to be. It was like when Scrooge is visited by the ghost of Christmas yet to come, and he's shown his death unless he makes significant life changes. I needed some changes. Significant ones. Unfortunately, I was still caught up in all of my own shit. Caught up in all of my own justified fears. So I decided to just hold off on making any real changes in my life. And I would do that until my junior year of high school. Until that point, though, I kept up my little show. I leaned into that edgy, angry character of the group. I kept getting in trouble, and I never really put any effort into not being in trouble. I was under the impression that I was getting away with my partying. I would sneak out in the middle of the night, and I would sneak back in before morning. My bed was purposely positioned under my window so that I could get in and out easily and quietly. I thought that I was so clever when I came home, just stoned out of my mind from hotboxing or just emptying a full can of Febreze to cover the smell and passing out on the couch. I thought I was clever. My parents knew. According to them, they even discussed all of it. My mom, she wanted to confront me about all of it and tear my ass a new one. And my dad calmed her and told her at least it's just weed. And if we confront him, he will rebel even more and probably try the harder stuff. And at least he comes home every night. Years later, when I admitted my partying days to them, thinking that it would be super shocking for them to find out, only to find out that I was the one super shocked, because my dad told me that they knew. They never really knew when I would sneak out, because I was really quiet about it, but they always knew when I got home. I asked him how they knew, and he laughed at me, saying, well, falling off of your bed and cursing loudly just isn't very sneaky. I don't know how they did it. I don't know how they found the strength to be able to go to bed on those nights, not knowing, but hoping that I would make it back. I don't know how they did it. I know that it couldn't have been easy. And to call it difficult has to be such a grand understatement. I hate to say it, but my dad was correct. My mind, it was so cluttered with so much bullshit, which had they confronted me, I probably would have gone off and just dove right into the nasty stuff. And chances are, I would not have made it back. There is no justification for that kind of mentality. I can't tell you what my friends thought, if they noticed my bullshit at all, saw any flaws in the persona that I carried, if they talked as a group about it without me. I don't know. I've never asked them, and to this day, I've only talked about a little bit of it with one of my closest friends. He was pretty blunt when we talked about it, and he told me that he absolutely hated that I had gotten into the party scene. He hated seeing me waste my life away. And disappointing him has always been one of the biggest regrets in my youth. And to this day, I work pretty damn hard to not let him feel disappointed in me again. But nothing lasts forever, right? Change was on the way. Sobriety was getting ready to pay me a visit. And I didn't know it at that time, but I was ready for it. In my junior year of high school, it set me on a path that I feel like I am still on to this day.